My sole purpose or function here is to settle you down and hand over to my distinguished colleague Dali Yang, who is going to moderate today's session. Dali is as you know, distinguished political scientist, scholar of China, but he's not going to speak today. He's simply going to introduce our speaker. So.
I am supposed to represent the Paulson Institute today also. The reason is I'm on the board, the faculty advisory board of the Paulson Institute, and I work with the Paulson Institute quite a bit, and I'm supposed to say something about it. Let me put it very succinctly. Hank Paulson was a distinguished businessman, former chairman of Goldman Sachs. He was a distinguished statesman. He was Treasury Secretary of the United States. When he was Treasury Secretary, of course, he was most well known for his for taking a great part in helping to save the economy. It's somewhat controversial, but of course you can't deny it. It's a very important move. But he also was critical in starting the U.S.-China strategic dialogue. So in that sense, actually, you can see that he played a major role also in U.S.-China relations. And of course, some of you may not know, he's a passionate person when it comes to the environment. If you combine these three aspects: his record as a businessman, his record as a statesman in international relations, his passion for the environment, you get the Paulson Institute. Essentially, what he wants to do with the Paulson Institute is promote economic growth and environmental protection in the United States and China, and of course, by also promoting U.S.-China relations. So there have been a variety of developments, both here, but also in Beijing and around China in terms of the Institute. Now, I also have the pleasure to introduce our very distinguished speaker today, Mr. Thant Myint-U, who is actually, Susato Chuli has a very impressive profile. He's served he's extremely well educated in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Cambridge in the UK. But more importantly, I found it really fascinating. He served in 3 peace missions, including in Cambodia and the former Yugoslavia. And you can already imagine the kind of experiences he had around the world. And of course, he also worked with the UN Secretariat. Of course, the UN is in his blood. His grandfather used to be the UN Secretary General. Of course, as a Chinese growing up in China, I heard a lot about those kind of matters at one point. Since in recent years, he's been back in Burma, and he's actually published a number of books. 2 of them are truly best-selling books, including In the Footsteps of, In the River of Lost Footsteps, and also Where China Meets India. And today he's going to speak with the title Burma and the New Crossroads of Asia. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here and to be with you here on this much colder than Rangoon day. I'm going to try to limit what I say to about 35 minutes or so we have as much time as possible for questions and answers, because that's really much more interesting for me to hear what you're interested in and try to respond. What I'm going to do in my presentation over the next 30-35 minutes is give you my sense of the different types of changes going on in the country today, try to take you a level deeper in terms of what I think are some of the underlying trends, give you a little bit of my sense of the broader historical context in which these things are happening, and then maybe point the way towards some scenarios for the future. So in terms of what's going on today, I think most of you will have read some of the headlines over the past couple of years. There have been major political as well as economic and other transformations taking place in the country. I think we need to think a little bit go back maybe a couple of years to talk about where these things started. If you go back to, say, 2007, 2008, for those of you who might have been following Burma at the time, it was a pretty bleak situation, or apparently very bleak situation. It was a pure military dictatorship under a military junta. There had been demonstrations led by Buddhist monks that had been crushed violently in 2007. This was then followed by a cyclone which killed 100,000 people. And in the aftermath of that, the government had been criticized for its response to emergency aid efforts. The economy was in quite dire straits, and very few people thought that at least the kinds of changes we've seen over the last couple of years were just around the corner. And so what happened? I think there were a few different things. One was that I think unseen by the outside, but very clear on the inside, the army regime had been working over the past 10, 15 years towards a new constitutional system, the constitutional system we have now, which was the one that they were comfortable with in taking a step back from day-to-day politics. And so it's not a fully democratic constitution, it's a constitution in which you have a partly elected parliament, but where 25% of the seats are reserved for army-appointed army officers, and where the army selects or appoints 3 army generals or 3 army officers to 3 key cabinet positions. It also has many other elements that kind of have reassured the army that it would lead to a government, at least in the first instance, that they were comfortable with in handing over day-to-day power to. And that was something that's actually been in the works for about 15, even 20 years since the mid-1990s. The second big element of why things began to change was the retirement of Senior General Thant Myint-U, who was the autocrat of the country. When we used to talk about Burma as a military junta, that was a bit misleading because that implied a sort of collective leadership, whereas in fact it was very much the rule of one man, at least by the 2000s. And this one man, Senior General Thant Myint-U, was turned 80 very recently, and I think when he approached 80, he made his personal decision that he would rather retire and that he would rather design and shape his transition rather than wait for his successor, rather than die, be on his deathbed still in power, and be in a weak position to shape that transition. And so he decided that he genuinely wanted to retire. I believe he is genuinely retired, but because he was a single autocrat that ruled, consolidated so much power, it left behind a huge power vacuum. So you had this new constitutional setup, you had the old autocrat retiring, leaving behind this power vacuum, and then you had the appointment of our current president, ex-general now, U Thein Sein. And I think another general with that same kind of strategic landscape might have played his hand differently. But General Thein Sein, when he became President Thein Sein and a civilian and became president in April of 2011, decided to take the hand that he was given and really push much further and faster in a couple of different directions, 3 different directions. The first was in terms of political liberalization. From the very beginning, he announced his desire to liberalize the political system and really push the envelope of what the constitutional system that had been set up would have given. He freed the media to a large extent. He has released now over 1,000, almost all political prisoners. He has allowed for a level of freedom of association that hasn't been in the country, that hasn't been allowed in the country for half a century. And in general, what has happened over the past couple of years is people are no longer afraid to speak their minds, to associate, to do what they please politically. Political parties are free in a way that they haven't been since the army takeover in 1962. So he has freed the political environment to in an unprecedented way. He's also reached out to the opposition. In August of 2011, he met with Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been the leader of the resistance or the opposition to the military regime for a long time, and she is now, as I think all of you know, been elected as a member of parliament and leads the second biggest party in parliament. But alongside that has been this set of economic changes. And I think one of the things that motivated him and motivated many other people, even within the regime, was this overwhelming sense by 2010, 2011, that the country was in an economic situation that it didn't need to be in. That for a country as naturally rich in resources as Burma, there was no reason that the people had to be so poor. And for the Burmese, often their view of the world, going back 50 years, 100 years, is a view of the world in which they are naturally much richer than China and India. The Burmese still see India and China as poorer countries than themselves. And the idea that India and China are now richer, and not just India and China, not just Singapore and Malaysia, but even Bangladesh, even even Cambodia. This was a huge shock, I think, to the Burmese psyche over the 2000s. And I think the idea that something needed to change for the country to catch up with the rest of the region and exceed the rest of the region was a very strong intellectual impulse for a lot of the reforms. And so what the president did, again in an unprecedented way, was from the beginning he appointed civilian advisors. And that doesn't seem like a very strange thing in a normal country, but in a country like Burma, which for 50 years has rejected, where the military leaders have rejected any civilian advice, this is actually a radical departure. And there have been huge moves since then that we can go into if you want, towards a much more rational set of economic policies designed to boost growth, designed to attract foreign investment, designed to increase trade, and to look in a rational way, again for the first time, at poverty reduction in the country. The president is also a committed environmentalist. Actually, one of the very few things that he was known for before he became president was his concern for the environment and environmental protection. One of his very first moves was to change the Ministry of Forestry, which until then had been in charge of cutting down all the forests in the country, to the Ministry of Environmental Protection. And this is one area where he's also asked for a lot of for assistance from the outside. The third area has been on the peace process, where he has been engaged through his chief negotiator, with whom I work very closely, on a series of different, on peace negotiations with not just one, but 17 different non-state armed groups, ethnic-based non-state armed groups in the country. It's one of the most complex peace negotiations ever tried, I think, anywhere in the world. So that's kind of what's going on. But I think to take a step back, what's important is to think about, I think, some of the underlying trends that are less visible from the outside. The first thing that I would mention as a really important underlying trend is the emergence for the first time in modern Burmese history of an independent business class. If you go back 100 years, you had rich people in Burma, but the rich people are almost all Scotsmen, some other Europeans, Indians, or Chinese. There were few rich Burmese, but there were very, very few. You had big British companies, mostly Scottish companies, and then you had a brief period after independence of a mixed economy, and then you had army rule and the nationalization of all businesses. What has happened over the last 20 years has been the emergence of a certain type of economy, marked a lot by a certain type of crony capitalism, in which an independent business class has emerged. Now, that business class, which is in the hundreds of people, I would sort of reckon, are mostly filled, not entirely, but mostly filled with men, some women, but mostly men, who started off as agents of a general who was also a minister. Their broker, their agent, and they would get rich out of licenses, out of rents from different state contracts, out of logging deals, out of brokering different business deals for these generals. But slowly over the past 10, 15 years, they have built up their own business conglomerates, organizations. They have the biggest organizations in the country, the most efficient and effective organizations in the country. And we are at a kind of tipping point between the relative power and influence of these men as businessmen versus the power and influence of the people who actually have public office and in the state. And the future of this business class and their relationship to state institutions is going to be very important in shaping, I think, a lot of politics going forward. I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes' time. The second huge shift, I think, that is taking place is the geographic shift in the country. Well, let me start with one other before geography, which is migration. The Burmese are now moving around like never before in modern times. You have millions of people not only moving to cities, but moving to mining towns, moving elsewhere in search of jobs. You have 3 million, we had a map up there, but we have 3 million Burmese now moving in search of work to Thailand. You have about 2 to 3 million, maybe even more, migrant Burmese workers in Thailand. You have 500,000 or so who've moved to Malaysia and are working there. You have a large diaspora. You have 100,000 or so Burmese skilled workers and professionals in Singapore. So there's an enormous movement of people around the country, and you have for the first time a diaspora where almost in every town, well, certainly in every town, but in almost in every village in the country, you will have many, many families who have relatives far away, whether in Bangkok or Malaysia or even further away in Canada or the US or Australia. And this is unprecedented. The Burmese were actually a relatively isolated people until recently. Even in the 1950s, very, very few people moved around or went abroad or had any relative abroad, but now almost everyone else does. And that's important for a reason I'll get to towards the end. The third major underlying change is geography. The geography of the country is fundamentally shifting. When you look at a map of Burma like this, you know, what strikes you is you have India on one side and China on the other, and then Thailand to the southeast. And it implies that kind of Burma is a nexus point or in the middle. But throughout history, Burma has not been that. Throughout history, Burma has actually been incredibly isolated, because what you don't see on this map are the mountains and the jungles that made travel from India to Burma overland and China to Burma overland almost impossible. Now, people since Han Dynasty times in China and since probably the 4th or 5th century in India did come across the border, but they were very, very few. There's even the possibility of a trade delegation from the Roman East who came overland through Burma to Yunnan in the 1st century AD. But these were very, very few. And it used to take, even in the 19th century, it took months to get from the center of Burma to, say, the Mandalay area to China, because you had these mountains and gorges, one mountain valley after another, malaria, tigers, elephants, crocodiles, everything else. People couldn't go. But now that basic physical geography is shifting. The first big road, the Burma Road, was built to help supply Chiang Kai-shek's forces during World War II, but that fell into disrepair after the Second World War. But now you have roads being built, you have, unfortunately, the forest being cut down. These physical barriers are falling away. So what you did not have before is what is emerging now, which is Burma as this nexus point between different parts of the Asian or the different subcontinental regions within Asia. And what it means internally in Burma is that traditionally you have the Irrawaddy Valley, which has been the richest part of the country, the agricultural, royal, state heartland of the country, and all the contacts abroad were by sea to South India and to Sri Lanka. That's where Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism came from. A lot of the cultural contacts came from southern India. And the populous centers, the important centers, were along the Irrawaddy Valley. What is happening now over these past 10 to 15 years, and is going to intensify over the next 10 to 15 years, is that a lot of the center is becoming a lot less important and much poorer in many ways, whereas it's the areas that used to be the periphery, like on the China border today, that are growing very rapidly and leading to a lot of local economic development and wealth creation. So places like Liza, Muse on the China border didn't even exist before. But then you have other little towns that used to be basically mud villages, you know, at the edge of the world, with almost nothing beyond China, months and months away, are now literally gateways on highways between Burma and China. So you have this basic shift in geography in which these areas, which are actually mainly ethnic minority areas, and now increasingly quite heavily Sinified areas, especially on the Chinese border, that are becoming very, very important, whereas the traditional heartland is becoming less important economically, and in many ways less important in some ways politically. A couple of other things. First, to put this in a broader historical context in terms of thinking about where we might be going from here. You know, as you all know, I mean, Burma was an independent kingdom. The British took over after a series of wars in the 19th century. The last kingdom was overthrown the last king was overthrown in 1885. And what you need to think about or remember about that is that the imposition of British colonial rule in the late 1880s was in Burma was a much more radical break with the past than in many other parts of the British Empire. Whereas in many other parts of the British Empire, the British continue to rule, if not through a local king or a local chief, through some sort of local elite. Whereas in Burma, in partly because of the strength of the Burmese guerrilla resistance to the British in the late 1800s, the British imposed a military bureaucratic state right down to the village level. And that meant that completely the rooting out of the entire social structure that had existed until then, and the imposition of a whole new set of colonial institutions. That then led to the emergence of a colonial political economy, which was based on the export of rice and the extraction of basic natural resources, oil and teak and precious stones as well. What that means is that for the Burmese, when modern Burmese politics first came on the scene 100 years ago, and this remains at the core of the Burmese political DNA and Burmese political culture and Burmese political thinking, is the idea that Burma's connections with the rest of the world and Burma's connections with global markets works against the Burmese people. At the center of the way in which the Burmese people have seen their interaction with the rest of the world is global capitalism and global markets, and the integration with global markets will result in a system where the Burmese people wind up at the bottom of the pyramid, and where you have foreigners and you have immigrants at the top, and then you have the Burmese at the bottom. And this anti-immigrant, anti-capitalism instinct is very, very strong in the Burmese political DNA. In the 1990s, Burma, a lot of people talk about Burma opening up now, but it actually opened up in the 1990s. Burmese way to socialism was abolished. The government wanted to remain an authoritarian government, but wanted to encourage foreign tourism and trade. And actually, by about 1995, Burma was ahead of Vietnam in terms of attracting foreign investment and setting up the systems for attracting foreign investment. But then boycotts, US sanctions resulted in the Asian financial crisis, and things turned around. But what did happen over the 90s and continued into the 2000s was China was there. So despite Western sanctions, China moved in economically very much. But because of the nature of China's engagement with Myanmar economically, very much based on resource extraction, very much based on companies that often had very few regulations that bound them, that were involved with sometimes very corrupt practices with the military regime at the time, that experience of the 1990s and 2000s with new companies that came in, Chinese but also Thai and from other parts of the region, intensified the feeling that capitalism and companies coming in were bound to be exploitative and were bound to work against ordinary people. Now, if you look forward from now, you have this mix where the country is on the verge of, or not on the verge, but the country is at an inflection point. The politics are much more open, but it's not yet a democratic system. You have a peace process that's in motion, but can still fail or succeed. You have many different scenarios in front. Ironically, in a scenario where the peace process is fairly successful, what you could see is an intensification of this shift in geography, where the border regions, especially with China and Thailand, grow very rapidly and become quite prosperous, leaving behind the old heartland of the country, the old ethnic Burmese heartland of the country. Also, ironically, if we move towards greater democracy, what you could see is that old heartland, which still represents the electoral majority, pushing back against this growing inequality between the periphery and the center. You could also see, ironically, if we move towards a slightly more democratic system, if we see new investments coming in that actually lead to greater social inequality, you could see a nationalist backlash against that economic opening, because you still have the rhetoric, you still have the culture, the political culture that is ready to, I think, voice that backlash if greater inequality comes up, or if the ethnic Burmese majority feels left behind, especially the agricultural, the rural ethnic majority, who so far has seen no improvements actually over the past many years. I'll just leave on one note, which is on the peace process. I think one thing that can make a huge difference going forward is the peace process, which I've mentioned. And the reason I say that it's at a key watershed is that even over these coming weeks, actually by the end of next week, by next Friday, we might actually be at a turning point. The government and 17 different non-state armed groups, almost all ethnic-based, have agreed to a series of ceasefires, basic ceasefires. All sides are now working towards what's going to be called a national ceasefire agreement, which is actually much more than a ceasefire. It will include not only very detailed agreements about monitoring, about aid into these areas, but also about the structure of peace talks going ahead. If that is signed and agreed over the coming weeks, then we will lead for the first time since 1962 to comprehensive political dialogue on the future of all these areas and to the constitutional amendments that might be necessary for a peace. Nothing in Burma in terms of further political liberalization, in terms of genuine economic development, will be possible without this foundation of an end to hostilities. But it's going to be an enormously difficult thing, because in addition to the 17 different non-state armed groups, you have over 800 different militia in these areas along the Burma-China border. And trying to just do a peace deal with one group is going to be difficult enough. To try not only to have a peace agreement with all of these different groups and really reshape the political economy of these areas is going to be not only a huge exercise, but really a critical exercise. It's only if that is all successful that we can do all of this, reach peace, have sustainable but equitable growth, attract foreign investment in a way that doesn't lead to a nationalist backlash, can we see Burma fulfill its potential as this nexus or crossroads point in Asia, and be an engine that can help drive growth in adjoining areas like Yunnan, Northeast India as well. But I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Well, that's certainly a very, very brief dissection of the complexities of the situation in Myanmar. And of course, many of you may have noticed I deliberately left out some of the titles of our speaker. He is, besides being chairman of the Yangon Heritage Center, he is a participant in the peace process as well. So in that sense, he's not just a witness, an analyst, he's actually sort of helping to shape the future of Myanmar. So for the remainder of the time, please ask your questions, but before you do so, identify yourself briefly so that our speaker could also get a sense of who you are. And of course, before I let the audience ask, since your talk is on the Myanmar as the new crossroads of Asia, perhaps you can speak briefly about this crossroads role in terms of, especially since you have written on actually where India and China meets.
Sure. I mean, as I said before, that you had these traditional physical barriers that are sort of falling away. Burma is not just next to the heartlands of China and India, it's next to very peripheral parts of China and India. If you look at China, I mean, Yunnan is an area that has only become majority ethnically Han Chinese over the past couple of hundred years, 150 years or so. It's really only over the last century, and especially since the communist takeover in the 1940s, that it's really been fully integrated into the rest of China. And even then, if you go to the frontier areas, or if you went to the frontier areas 30, 40 years ago, you would see this fraying of state power on both sides. But what you've had over the past 20 years is this intensification of economic ties, which has been mainly based on the one hand, the export of consumer goods from Yunnan into all sorts of consumer goods from Yunnan into northern Burma in particular, and from Burma trade or export of both legal products and a lot of illegal trade as well, contraband trade, drugs, there's a lot of illegal logging, illegal mining, and a huge jade industry that's estimated at worth between $5 and $10 billion a year alone. On the India side, you have an even more peripheral part of India, northeast India, that's practically cut off from the mainland of India, connected only by this chicken's neck a couple of miles wide, with Bangladesh kind of blocking off northeast India from the rest of India. It's ethnically, culturally very distinct. And of course, in a way, northeast India is also, like much of Burma, a very poor, conflict-ridden area. So it's not like you have Bangalore or Bombay just next door. And in the short run, it's maybe things won't change dramatically. But if we look at this long scope of history, I think over the next 15, 20, 30 years, you will see this coming together, this weaving together of parts of India and China that may not change China and India basically, but I think will be of extreme importance to the southwest of China and the northeast of India, to have these outlets for China to the southwest China to the Bay of Bengal, to Burma and to markets in ASEAN, and for northeast India to Burma and ASEAN overland. So I think this will be of fundamental importance to those regions of China, maybe not less so to the rest of the countries.
Hi, I'm Paul Stanland. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department. I work on political violence in South Asia. And I've been starting to do research the last year and a half or so on Myanmar. Something I've found in doing research both in northern Thailand with ethnic armed groups, but also in Yangon, including at the Myanmar Peace Center, is a certain uncertainty about kind of the logic of the military and control over the military, and this fear that these personality-driven top-down reforms are quite fragile. There are still clashes ongoing in Shan State, part of Kachin areas. So I'm curious, how do you think about kind of the military's role in this emerging political situation, and how aligned are its interests with those of the people leading the peace process and, you know, this kind of broader reform trajectory?
It's difficult to say because I think, well, a couple of things. One is that the leadership of the military as an institution is, as you know, a new leadership that's come about only over the last couple of years. When Senior General Thant Myint-U decided he wanted to retire, the most important thing for him to do was, over the past 4 or 5 years, retire all of his potential rivals. And so all the lieutenant generals, the other generals who were more or less the same age, were retired away. Then you had the next group who were maybe 10 years younger, who were also retired but who've been recycled in different positions in government or in parliament. And so then the senior generals sort of reached down to much younger men who were then in their late 40s, about 50, and promoted them up as these new generals. So the current leadership of the army are not the old leadership of the army, they're completely new. So part of the answer is, I think they themselves are not sure what their position should be. If you ask them a specific question, what do you think about this constitutional amendment? What do you think about this possible provision of peace agreement? I don't think they'll give you an answer, but it's not as if they have. I think that's true of a lot of people in the country. People don't have very clearly what, a set out strategic vision that they're following. That may be different in a year or two's time, but I think even up until now, they don't have that answer. I think the second thing is that the second part of the puzzle is that you have, as you suggest, you have a peace process that's been very driven by the president in his office with the support of the Myanmar Peace Center and others. And I think up until now, in general, the trend it has taken in terms of trying to reach ceasefires, saying that it will then move towards political talks, haven't been very controversial. There might be personal rivalries, but it hasn't been that controversial. When push comes to shove, and there are actual issues that touch up on institutional interests, whether by the army or others, or touch on real changes to the political economy in those areas and the way in which different institutions or individual people make money, then it's unclear what the pushback might be at that point. But I think at this point it's not there, and it's not crystallized in any way. Lastly, in terms of the clashes that take place, they're actually very, very complicated. If you have the ceasefires, but you've had a continuation of some clashes in different areas, it's much, much less. The fighting is 95% less than it was when the ceasefires changed, and that would be a good situation in many ceasefire situations. In the southern Shan states, you have literally 200 different local militia groups, pro-government, pro-different groups. They clash, and usually when the information about those clashes reach the top people, whether in Myanmar Peace Center or on the armed ethnic group side, then they intervene and then it's gone. So there are local level clashes between militias. In some places they may involve the army directly or other groups directly, and different sides will say different things about the reasons, but at the heart of it, it is about revenue control in these areas. And in terms of, because you have a lot of gray areas where you have people who set up checkpoints, toll roads, a small logging operation, a small gold mining operation. And I think the most difficult part about the ceasefire is going to be what is going to be the interim revenue sharing arrangement. The very last thing I'll say is that one big achievement, though, is that the president and his minister, U Min, has managed politically in different ways to take the concept of federalism from being a taboo subject to being something that is now on the table to be discussed. And I think that alone is a big achievement.
Colin Mummer, I think I'm Dean of the Hard School. It seemed to me that Burma, in a way, is a label given to a territory, but the integrity of that territory is not immediately obvious. In other words, there's the heartland, which is Burmese, and then there are these other areas. Burma was a colonial power, I guess, itself, and therefore dominated a number of areas over a long period of time. And the British, of course, fostered the divisions between the Burmese and the hinterland. As you mentioned the word federalism, so I guess my question is, what outcome do you think is sustainable outcome. It's probably not having central control from of the whole of the territory, and to what extent is federalism, what kind of federalism is seen as a possibility?
I guess the easy answer is that it will be some sort of federal system where you will have a greater devolution of responsibility and power and revenue power and everything else. I think beyond that, in terms of thinking about what type of federalism, exactly what the relationship will be between the center and regional governments, I don't think anyone on any side has thought this through. And what my hope is that over the coming year, if we have a genuine political dialogue, it will be also the opportunity for a lot of outside people to come and share experiences in terms of knowledge about other countries' federal systems and setups as well. In a way, we have to turn that weakness, which is a lot of people don't have these detailed concepts, into an opportunity for sort of shared learning about other experiences as well. But that's kind of the easy answer, because I think that the tough part is also, you have so many different subgroups as well, or groups within groups and smaller minority groups. So you take the Shan state alone, and the Shans want a federal system where the Shan state becomes a devolved sort of entity. But within the Shans themselves are about 50-60% of their own state, and then you have dozens of other smaller minority groups, some of whom want their own state, like the Wa. So how does one devolve within that devolution, and to what level do you do it? And you take a country like Burma, where you have dozens of different ethnic groups. How can one balance the need to address the legitimate desires of these different nationalities who now have their own nationalisms for autonomy or self-determination, with the fact that this is a relatively small country still next to two huge giant countries? What if what I said is true, and that you have these physical barriers moving away, you're going to have a much closer relationship with both China and India overland in terms of trade and things. It may have meant something for a group of, say, 500,000 people to have devolved autonomy 30 years ago, when it was relatively isolated. What does it mean really today? And I don't think anyone has really thought that through. I think the most difficult thing, though, will be the easy parts will also be issues about discrimination, issues about language policy, which have been agreed in principle, that mother tongue language at primary school level will be agreed, those sorts of things. But the political economy of these areas, where the army has had a big role traditionally, and where a lot of these armed groups have big business operations as well, I think that's going to be a more difficult part than the kind of on-paper federal arrangements which might be agreed to over the next couple of years.
Because one can point to countries of similar size like Switzerland and all that, which are also in very difficult terrain and also with a lot of ethnic groups, and there are some interesting experience there.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Yanli Thompson, and I'm a third-year undergraduate history major, and I grew up in Singapore. China and India have a very tense relationship militarily. I think they both have spent more money on their navies, a race for a better aircraft carrier and whatnot. Could you possibly comment on the Burmese role in this relationship and the potential they have in this relationship? Would China's huge economic presence in Burma make them more inclined towards a friendlier military relationship with China, or would there be a backlash towards would they be more inclined towards India in that sense?
I think over the last 20 years, you've had a situation where China has been far and away the most important economic partner of the country. The other country, Thailand important too in terms of some investments. Singapore in a very niche and special way, because that's where a lot of elite sort of Burmese have always gone for hospital treatment, to go shopping, to do their banking, and so that's played a special role. But in general, in terms of investment and everything else, it's been China. But that has never really, and because China has offered diplomatic protection to the regime, the Security Council, and because China has also maintained quite close military to military, or tried to develop quite close military to military relations as well. But that hasn't really translated into political influence in terms of familiarity and sort of close relations. There's not a single person in the Burmese government or regime before who spoke Chinese or who had friends in China, so it wasn't a close relationship in that way. And in a way, a lot of the things that the Burmese government have done over the past couple of years are things that Chinese have been asking them to do: not be an international pariah, begin to reform, try to improve relations with the West. I think China has been a little bit surprised by the extent to which some of the new political space has been filled by a lot of anti-China sentiment and sentiment against Chinese projects, like the Myitsone Dam, which was cancelled a couple of years ago. I think in Burma or Myanmar itself, in the government and in the political establishment, there is a consensual view that the country's foreign policy should be one where it's friends with everyone on an equal basis. I mean, there's no kind of pro-China versus pro-India versus there's no factions in that way within the Burmese political establishment. In general, I think at the center of the government and the president and the ministers around the president, the desire is to repair and improve relations with the West and other countries that have imposed sanctions in the past, Japan and others, as quickly as possible, but not at the expense of injuring relations with China or other other neighboring countries. I think there's a overall desire not to be involved in any sort of competitive politics between China, the US, India, Japan, and instead really to exploit the feeling that all these countries want to be friends with China. So where that takes us in the longer term, I think it's hard to know. But I think a lot of the what has happened definitely over the last couple of years, though, is that the scenario where sanctions will remain indefinitely and China would be locked in as the country's only big trading partner, I think that's no longer going to be the case.
In fact, a little surprised that so far ASEAN hasn't entered into the discussion here, but maybe some in the future when we have further questions, you can work that in.
Nice. Prem Panchal, I'm the second year at the Booth School of Business. I spent a month in Myanmar this summer, just kind of talking to investors and trying to see if there's opportunity. And the big concern was the coming elections and a potential change of leadership. What do you see as the biggest concerns to threats to stability through that process?
Yeah, good. I think it's going to be a really critical time. It'll be the first elections after this sort of political opening has taken place. It's going to be probably in November of 2015. It has to be by the end of 2015. My guess is that it'll be a relatively free and fair election in the sense that it won't be rigged, that people will be free to organize and to vote for whom they want. But it will be within this constitutional setup where in the end the army will still have 25% of the seats in parliament. I think a big question right now in the country is whether or not there'll be an amendment to Constitutional Clause 59F, which effectively bars Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the most popular politician in the country, from being president, because that constitutional clause says that no one can be president, that person can be something else, but cannot be president or vice president if they have an immediate family member who is a foreign citizen, and she has two sons who are foreign British citizens. I doubt very much that constitutional clause will be revised before the end of 2015. So what you might have is, in that scenario, a situation where the army has 25% of the seats in parliament, ethnic minority parties win another 25% of the seats in parliament, especially if the peace process goes well and everyone's able to participate freely. And then the NLD Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, does very well and captures a lot of the remaining 50%, which means that you would have a mixed parliament and you would require a negotiated outcome. I think what's extremely important at that point is that everyone acts in a very responsible way and tries to come up with something that's perhaps not their maximum position, but something that will at least keep the process moving forward. Because I think the army leadership has no desire to move back into power, but anything that leads to an outward political crisis is, of course, something that would then tempt the army to want to assert its position that much more so. And I think we have to move in a position into a scenario where the army moves further back from politics, and that means an election and a process, an agreement on a government that is as widely agreed to as possible within the political establishment.
Thank you for coming, sir. I'm a second year in the college. I'm Parker Thomas. As far as Burma's growing importance internationally, do you see it as more, what do you think will be a bigger influence? Countries responding to Burma and kind of making an effort to get involved in Burma's modernization, or Burma reaching out to these bigger superpowers and of its own volition, getting involved? Yeah,
no, it's a good question. I know what you're getting at, but it's difficult to say. I mean, on the one hand, in Burma, there's a deep desire, as I mentioned before, to catch up with the rest of the world, right? Because by 2010, despite the sanctions, despite the government's own policies, the country was, at least the elite in the country, was much better connected with the rest of the world than before. People were going to Bangkok, people were going to Singapore, there was satellite TV, you could see the rest of the world from your living room. And so there's a deep, and a lot of parents who could afford it were sending their kids to university abroad. And so there's a deep desire to kind of re-engage with the rest of the world. And I think this government has tried very hard to try to improve relations with the US and other Western governments. But the capacity to do this is very limited. And in a way, you have countries now from the outside, whether it's the Japanese or the Americans or others, coming in to try to provide aid or engage or encourage their own businesses in different ways. But the way in which these two things come together, I guess, is still very weak, because the experiences are not there, the history of relations is not there, and the institutions are very, I mean, you only have to go to Burma to see how weak the institutions are. You have major government institutions which still don't have computer systems, maybe the electricity is intermittent. I mean, we're talking about really basic things that don't exist for the country to re-engage with global institutions in the right way. In terms of how countries on the outside could engage, it depends on what area. I mean, there's an enormous need for institutional development. But how that actually happens, what kind of programs would work best, I think it's going to be a trial and error thing, because there's no other place in which, I mean, there are many other places where this has been tried, but I don't think there are that many good examples where it's worked, especially in an environment like Burma.
The last two questions here. Okay.
Thank you so much. My name is John Ellis. I'm an alumnus of the medical school and spent a couple of decades on the faculty there. I left Yangon on Monday there as a tourist. And it was interesting, in the time I was there, I heard a lot of comments about the economic influences of the generals. So you suggested that there's an independent business class as the economy opens. I wonder how those two balance going forward, perhaps some of the concerns he might have. And also essentially how, your book is entitled Between China and India, you have 3 billion people surrounding you. Do you become subsumed by those economic powers?
I guess, yeah. In terms of being subsumed by the two economic powers, I don't think it's a danger, in the immediate. Because I think, going back to what I said in the beginning, you have this incredibly strong nationalist impulse, and I think long before you have anything that looks like economic domination from one country or a set of countries, you will have a big nationalist backlash. I think even on things like tourism, it's not going to be like Thailand, it's not going to be like some other countries. When you first start to see tourists misbehaving, tourists acting in a way that you're going to have a nationalist backlash in Burma. It's a country which is actually traditionally very conservative, and where that nationalist sentiment is quite strong, and where a lot of people feel that nationalist sentiment has been held back by military rule. And so I think it will express itself more in the coming years in different ways. In terms of the generals versus the businessmen, it's very complicated, because it's not so much, again, the serving generals. It's the old ex-generals who had nurtured some of these businessmen. And so these businessmen themselves have now grown into the heads of these major corporations or conglomerates. They are still partners, maybe not of the generals themselves, who might be retired off in some way, but their kids or their families still make money off the connections with these conglomerates. But what is the connection between this new business class, these new business conglomerates with, say, the existing generals? Will these existing generals, even if the connections are not there, will it be a system where the existing generals retire at 60, unlike wait till they're 80, they retire at 60 and then somehow partner with these companies, in which case there will be quite a tight relationship going forward between the army as an institution and these different companies. Will this new business class see partnering with outside companies as a way forward with them, or will they see generally foreign competition as something that's hostile to their interests? I think right now what you see is a strong protectionist feeling emerging from the local business community as well. Blaming to some extent the president's office for a liberalization of the economy that has gone too fast, and wanting now, in the absence of sanctions and everything else, some limitations to foreign trade and investment coming in. So, for example, we saw that happening just a few days ago, where the government decided that it was going to put a limit on foreign investment in tourism. That foreign investors in tourism would have to work through local partners, and there could not be 100% foreign investment in tourism. And that is a sign, to some extent, of the government's own thinking, but it's also a sign of the strength of a lot of local business lobbying who want to maintain a big part. So it could go different ways, and I think they are, like everyone else, the generals, the opposition group, they are unformed still in terms of thinking about where their strategic interests are going to lie in the future.
Hello, my name is Eugene Han. I'm a student at the Harris School. Thank you very much for talking to us today. I will quote Foreign Policy that has a story reporting that Chinese academics are calling for China to give up on dealing with Myanmar's increasingly democratic-leaning government and instead throw its support to the border groups. I mean, of course, it's like an extremist kind of thing, but if you would put yourself in the shoes of the Chinese policymakers, where you would have on one side this desire to protect your investments, right, and the interests of the Chinese enterprises, given the fact that you would probably have more leverage with the border groups than with the central government, that there is somehow a national thing and less dependence on China, what would be your strategy as a Chinese foreign policy maker of getting involved or not?
Yeah. Well, I mean, China has a long history of being involved with a lot of the border armed groups. I mean, the main border armed groups are remnants of the old Communist Party of Burma, which was placed in that position in 1968, 1969 by China. And so China has a long history of supplying, engaging with these groups. These groups are very dependent on China for trade and everything else. So the connections are very strong. Not with all of the groups, like the Kachin Independence Army, but from most of the other groups along the Burma-China border. But you know, they represent maybe 1% of the population. So it's not there's no choice between engaging with 1% of the population and 99% of the population. These are also areas which are sources of a huge amount of criminality in Yunnan. These are where there are big casino operations, big money laundering operations, gun running operations, all kinds of things, human trafficking, that neither the central Chinese government nor the Kunming government administration nor the Burmese government want. So it's not an option to try to boost some of these groups like the Mongla Army, which has a big casino operation in Mongla along the border. I think for China, and I think the Chinese government feels this too. I mean, some sort of sustainable peace in this area is now very much in their strategic interest. To have, you know, a huge strategic shift for Thailand as well as China was that 30 years ago it was fine to have these border areas almost in chaos, right? Because their own countries were all over the place. The economies were in a completely different shape. But now, with the economies growing, with these countries modernizing, nobody wants to have uncontrolled, wild frontier areas. So finding some sort of way to achieve peace in these border areas is pivotal for all of these countries going forward. I think in terms of protecting China's economic interests, there are three levels of interest. One are China's strategic economic interests, which are about its natural gas pipeline, it's about access across Burma to the Indian Ocean, and to some extent, and that's one. The second is the Yunnan level of business interests, which are about some of these big hydropower projects. It's about access to the Burmese markets, and that also needs some sort of genuine peace. The only economic interest that would benefit from no peace and close relations with some of these border armies are just the very small frontier businesses who are involved in illegal logging, mining across the border, and that is a tiny part of even Yunnan. Well, it's not a tiny part of Yunnan's economy, but it's a tiny part of China's economy.
Well, on that note, I think you're all riveted to the talk. This is such an incredibly informative conversation that you have heard, and I think for some of you, especially, I think this is an opportunity, sort of an invitation almost to Burma in many ways to find out. But in any case, thank you all for coming to this event.
Thank you.